Yeah, through urine. That's where I measure the organic acids, and the organic acids are that functional readout, the receipts kind of our metabolism.
Hello, and welcome to the Rise Again podcast. My name is Dr. Peter Risenen, and I'm your host here at the Rise Again podcast. Now, we're on to season 2, and the thing about season 2 that's going to differentiate it from season 1 are the things that I've gone through in my life since we were doing season 1. We have recently fostered and adopted a newborn. I killed my first bull elk with my bow and arrow last fall, and I've gotten into fly fishing, as well as am now the medical director of a men's health and testosterone replacement business. This has all been majorly life-changing for me, and I'm super excited to share some of the journey with you guys through the Rise Again podcast. So I hope you guys get something out of this. If you guys love it, please rate it and review it, share it with your friends. Let's get this stuff out there. We're going to share some amazing guests, and I hope you guys really enjoy season 2 of the Rise Again podcast. Welcome back, everybody, to the 73rd episode of the Rise Again podcast. And today, super excited to sit down with my great friend and fellow naturopathic physician, Dr. Warren Brown. Warren is an exceptionally advanced physician who works with people in the sports and optimization field. He earned his undergraduate degree from Kennesaw State University and his doctorate degree from the School of Naturopathic Medicine at Bastyr University in Seattle, Washington. Completed his clinical rotations at the Bastyr Center for Natural Health and several other clinics throughout the state of Washington. He then went on to complete an 18-month clinical residency program at Tacoma, Washington, during which he also worked with the medical staff for the Seattle Sounders U23 soccer team. Dr. Brown's completed additional coursework in functional medicine and has lectured at functional and integrative medicine conferences across the United States on the topic of laboratory testing. He's also served as a contributor to the 5th edition of the Textbook of Natural Medicine. Since 2012, Dr. Brown has been helping athletes and active individuals to reach their highest levels of health and performance through his advanced clinical approach. He also serves in a consultant role for medical staff members of several professional sports teams and is currently writing his first book on naturopathic sports medicine. Dr. Brown's a member of the American College of Sports Medicine and the Georgia Association of Naturopathic Physicians. He holds a naturopathic physician license in Arizona in the United States. Today, Dr. Brown and I sit down and talk about his framework in his practice, the 6 clinical advances for sport. He has this really unique framework. These things are all kind of a really important coalescing and an important part of one whole, all these components. So we're going to talk about digestive efficiency, energy production, cell signaling, structural integrity, detoxification, and the immune response. So these are all different parts of the framework in which he works. I hope you guys enjoy today's podcast with Dr. Warren Brown, really kind of taking your life, and especially if you're an athlete or you just really want to take your life to the next level. Dr. Brown and I today are going to uncover some things that might be of use to you. So stay tuned and reach out to Dr. Warren Brown after the podcast. Let him know what you thought. I'll put his links and connection stuff for you guys in the show notes. Thanks so much. Hope you guys enjoy the show. Welcome back, everybody, to the Rise Again podcast. Really excited to have one of my good friends in the studio today, Dr. Warren Brown. Just to give a little bit of background, I met Dr. Warren Brown when I was a first-year medical student at Bastyr University, and we were working at the Seattle Marathon, and he was the resident physician working there. And that was just really there was something really special about that event. Your interactions with all the students was really great. I mean, some of my former roommates were working there too, Dr. Susan Gray and some of the other ones there as well. But it was just like a really cool event. Anyways, I've kept in touch with you, and from all my memories, it seems like you go way back, right back to the beginning. So
yeah.
Good to be here with you.
It's awesome to be here. Any chance we have to get together, it's always a pleasure.
It's fantastic. So you've got a move on the horizon, moving back to Georgia from Arizona, where you've been here for a couple of years. Give us a little bit of background here as to what's been going on these past couple of years. And
my wife and I have really enjoyed our time here in Arizona. We've grown in various ways and really love the scenery out here and the people. But most of my family's back in Georgia. Most of her family is back in Georgia. So we're headed back there. and pretty excited about it.
Well, the neat thing about what you do, I mean, work-wise, like you could be anywhere in the world and really be doing what you want to do. But the really neat thing that I think that you're doing is putting your family as a priority in your life. And so you're like, okay, you know what? There's some needs that we have at home, and let's get back home. But what you do and what we're going to probably spend some time with too, you're able to be reached from anywhere in the world, really.
Yeah, a lot of what I do for my practice is virtual, and a lot of what I do consulting for one of the bigger functional medicine laboratories in the US is also virtual. I'm able to do both of those from pretty much anywhere, so I'm really thankful for that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I remember when you started working for the big laboratory. I mean, this was back when I was still in school. You came and gave a presentation at the school. It was really, really informative. I had been to a functional medicine conference already. I believe I had been there, or I was going to be going. I think actually I went after your presentation. But learning about what you do, I think one of the really neat things about bringing you on the podcast and talking with you about sports and about metabolism and about your practice and all the different things that you do, I feel like you are the missing link for a lot of people to be able to optimize the performance that they're trying to get out of whatever they're trying to do.
Yeah, I think of myself as kind of working in that gray area between, I'm not the orthopedic doctor that you go to for, surgeries or broken bones, things like that. I'm also not the dietitian who you'd go to for very specific information about diet. And I'm not the chiropractor and physical therapist who are also important parts of the sports medicine team. I'm not any of those. I'm really focused on sports metabolomics, which is a really new field. And basically that's just focusing on the biochemistry of sport. That's what's been my focus for the last several years. And sports have always been part of my practice since the beginning. I've just sort of found myself in this niche of sports metabolomics, and I love that.
Why don't you explain what Metabolobinx is, just in a general sense, so that people can kind of get an understanding of how this applies to them?
Yeah, it's looking at metabolites. That's part of our biochemistry, part of everyone's biochemistry. Our cells basically are converting and changing different substances for the purpose of different processes in the body. So looking at the metabolism of the cell by looking at things like organic acids, which are kind of like a functional readout of the cell, you can get a lot of information about how that cell is functioning. And this could be things like mitochondrial function. It could be things like detoxification, could be neurotransmitter metabolism. Those things you can get a lot of data from using specialty diagnostics. And so that's a big part of my practice. You can get a lot of information from urine or blood or stool or saliva. I look at all of those when I have the option to do so. It's basically looking at cellular metabolism, looking at the biochemistry of it, and figuring out where is the metabolic blockage or blockages, and then addressing those from a naturopathic perspective. So that's kind of what it is. Basically looking at a functional readout of cellular metabolism and then making some adjustments to their diet and lifestyle to help maximize that.
So you're looking at a lot of outputs, right? We've got inputs coming in, which are like our diet, lifestyle, sleep, all the things that we're doing in our life are all inputs. Our body processes them. And then you're looking at the outputs, which give us information as to like how we need to change the inputs so that the outputs can be optimized, maybe.
Yeah, it's a good way to say it.
I was privileged enough to get a pretty comprehensive panel. I felt like it was a really neat panel from Genova, from the company that, you're associated with. It was really neat to be able to sit down and be like, okay, here's where digestive, I'm interested in looking at these. How's your energy production? How's your, like you were able to tell me about amino acids, like looking at, so let's break it down even more simpler about like specific, maybe carbohydrates and fats and proteins. And was I getting enough of certain things? And then what was happening in my digestive tract? Like where the bacteria were making something extra. And you were like, oh, that's a little interesting. Are you taking in X, Y, and Z? And then if you are, maybe we should modify that so that, because this is associated with not maybe as optimal of outcomes as we really want for somebody's performance.
Mm-hmm.
So I felt like the way that you took my information, it was interesting because you kind of described some of the things that I was experiencing just by looking at the lab work that you had in front of you, which was, which is kind of like, oh, dude, how do you know all this stuff? It's like, well, I'm looking at your lab.
Yeah. I love that part of the job, because part of my job with Genova is consulting with clinicians who've ordered tests on their patients, and they're looking for my opinion or second set of eyes on the test results, just to say, I'm not quite sure what's going on here. What, can you help me? And I'll look at a test result and I'll say, well, based on what I'm seeing here, does this patient have this symptom, this symptom, this symptom? And it's really cool to see that, yeah, often that's the case.
I think that's awesome. So you've got, what you're doing is seriously very high value for Genova. I mean, to have somebody in that people can call, clinicians like myself can call if we have questions on anything, to just have that advanced set of eyes on something who can give us some insight, that's phenomenal. Now you've got something really, really cool that I want to talk to you about, which is your private practice, clinical advances for sport.
Right.
Let's talk about, because this is like your area of expertise and your area of passion. So why don't you tell us about how this came to be and tell us about your practice a little bit?
Yeah, I always like to try and bring some structure to something. Over the years of doing this, I've looked at naturopathic framework and functional medicine framework and conventional sports medicine and all of that. And I've tried to basically build a framework around what I do, how I practice, and the areas that I focus on and the areas where I can really make a difference. And so I've developed this basically framework where I'll look at a patient's ability to digest I'll usually use stool testing to go through that. Digestion and absorption, that's where we're basically turning matter into energy, which is, it still blows my mind that we can do that. But this is, digestive efficiency is a big part of what I do. So that's one arm of my protocol. Energy production, looking at how fats.
Let's go back to digestion real quick.
Sure.
So we're just going to take a bit by bit on each one of these. So digestive function. So you're saying that somebody who submits a stool test, you can learn a ton from that stool test for somebody. What are the different pieces that you're looking at when you're looking at digestive efficiency?
Well, specifically, markers related to digestion and absorption of fats and proteins, pancreatic function, inflammation markers, ruling out inflammation or addressing it if it's present. Immune responses. I mean, most of our immune system is in the gut. So if there's an upregulation of that immune system, that can create a whole list of issues. And then microbiome testing, which has exploded over the last 10 years. There's so much more we know about the microbiome now than we did 10 years ago. The published literature on it is really evolving rapidly. So I incorporate that into my testing as well.
I feel like you guys kind of led the way with that stuff, even with Genova. I mean, the teaching the practitioners who come to the IFM conferences and whatever else. But I mean, you were a big part of that, right? I mean, I think about it in that way. Yeah, the research was out there, but I mean, bringing that to the clinician is another whole piece. There's a lot of research that's out there that's not brought to clinicians to be able to use. And I feel like you guys were on the cutting edge of that, gut bacteria thing, when people are, I mean, everyone I know, even if they're not patients of mine, they come to me and I'm like, what are you taking supplements wise? I mean, everyone's like, I'm taking a probiotic, so people know about the gut microbiome and gut bacteria. Even the lay people know about it, right? They see probiotics in the store.
Yeah. It's becoming mainstream, but the testing hasn't really followed that. Sometimes I'll have patients say, well, can I get this stool test from my conventional doctor? And chances are, most of the time, conventional doctors, I won't speak for everyone, but most of the time, conventional doctors are just looking for parasites in a stool test. So with all of the evolving literature in the microbiome and Genova kind of being at the forefront of bringing that to clinicians in an innovative way, it makes it a lot easier to integrate that into practice and make some good quality clinical decisions based on that data.
That's the difference right there. I mean, we could talk about this with a lot of the different components that we're going to talk about, but people could waste an infinite amount of money taking things that aren't even actually beneficial for them, where instead of that, they could get a good assessment and essentially be, like not every probiotic is probably going to be beneficial for your gut. Some actually might be more harmful than beneficial, right?
Right. Overgrowth of bacteria is probably not going to be helped by a probiotic most of the time. So small intestine bacterial overgrowth, for instance, is a situation where a probiotic may not be helpful. A patient may have, I'm sure you've seen this a lot, gas and bloating, or they might feel poorly after taking a probiotic or eating fermented foods or high fiber foods. Sometimes those create problems for patients with SIBO. That is a really common problem.
See, this is really important for people to hear. Different bacteria are associated with different outcomes, especially if they're really high or they're really low in quantity.
Mhm.
So dialing that stuff in and optimizing someone's, because this is how I think about bacteria. They are actually the interface between us and our food. You're actually not doing all the digestive work and taking in all the nutrients without those bacteria there
Mhm.
to actually do the work to give us what we need to be able to take in.
Isn't that amazing? That's just mind blowing.
It's amazing. They are the reason we are alive. So anyways, my mind is blown by that.
They'll take some foods like amino acids or fiber, or they'll take something that we're eating, they'll work on it, they'll metabolize it. Those metabolites that are generated from that then are in a better position to help us. So it's just this symbiotic relationship. And if those bacteria are out of balance or overgrowing or undergrowing, that means that we lose out on some of the benefit from that.
Amazing. So that was really neat to be able to talk about bacteria and gut bacteria. And you talked about enzymes are obviously important. We got to break down the food that's coming in. So do you have digestive issues, whether it's with fats or with specific proteins or with specific carbohydrates, things like that? You're able to tell with a lot of the testing and the work that you do, which is head and shoulders above what they're going to get from any other practitioner that's out there. So I think that that's really special that you offer that kind of insight, because that can only make an athlete or somebody who's depending on the efficiency of the food they come in to give them the results that they want.
It's fun to watch, and it's fun to watch patients get better and get answers, because a lot of times they're tough cases. They're, for some reason, something's not working. They've gone through they've seen their conventional doctor. Sometimes the solution is, hey, we don't know what's going on here. Take this antidepressant. To be able to take the case one step further and try to look for some root cause functional imbalances is really rewarding, especially when they start to get better.
Yeah, no, it's so cool. Oh, I love that. So let's move on to your one of the next pieces of the framework. So the first one we talked about was digestive efficiency. Next one is
energy production.
Energy production. Beautiful.
Yeah, basically, my interest here is around mitochondrial function, focusing on mitochondrial function. Those are the pieces of cellular machinery that we all have that help to generate energy. They're the powerhouse of the cell. And for athletes, mitochondria are more concentrated in muscle cells. So if those mitochondria are not working properly, which can often be due to a lack of nutrients like B vitamins or CoQ10 or glutathione or minerals, by finding those deficiencies and then addressing those, we can get better mitochondrial function. So that's really kind of that's my sort of interpretation of energy production as part of my program.
When your average athlete is thinking of, and people who are trying to take things to the next level, what are some of the symptoms that you see with low energy? I mean, it's not always going to be fatigue, is it? I mean, what are some of the things that you're seeing as far as needing to be optimized, or symptoms that would clue somebody into, hey, energy production is probably something that we can dial in here?
Yeah, fatigue is probably the biggest one, maybe the most obvious one to most patients. But we need ATP, which is the end game for mitochondria, making ATP. We need that to move things across cell membranes. That could have widespread effects throughout the body. But symptom-wise, it's usually something like fatigue. But brain fog is fairly common. We have a lot of need for mitochondria to support cognition, mental sharpness, things like that. So there can be a lot of reasons for fatigue, and there can be a lot of reasons for brain fog, but mitochondria do play a role there.
Okay. Like you talked about urine, blood, stool, like you're seeing the ability to figure this out through those different samples as well.
Yeah, through urine, that's where I measure the organic acids, and the organic acids are that functional readout, the receipts kind of our metabolism.
Beautifully said. I've never thought about it that way. The receipts of our metabolism. Beautiful verbiage there. I love that. Wow. Okay. So energy production and then cell signaling, maybe a little bit more complex for the average person to understand, but talk about cell signaling, which is the third part of your framework a little bit.
This is part of your wheelhouse too. I think of you as being extremely well educated in this. For athletes, I focus on cortisol because I find that it's one of the most commonly elevated hormones. Patients who, let's say they're doing intense, prolonged physical activity, that can drive up cortisol levels. And if they're also working a stressful job, or they have stress at home, or it just seems like, especially since the pandemic started, people's stress levels have been elevated more so than before the pandemic. At least that's what I'm seeing. Cortisol is a cell signaler. Basically, it's a hormone. So that's any substance that's produced by the body that goes to a different part of the body and communicates with it. I focus on cortisol, but I also measure male hormones, female hormones. That's all part of the assessment. But basically what I mean by cell signaling is just the communication between cells, which is accomplished by hormones.
That's beautiful. What are some of the downstream effects of high cortisol concentrations on the person? So, you've got the stressed out individual. They know they're stressed, but what are some of the things that they're probably feeling in addition, or some of the symptoms, things that are going on in their life?
Things like brain fog, things like fatigue, things like low libido, could be weight gain around the midsection.
What about sleep stuff? I'm curious about
Absolutely. Yeah, poor sleep, high cortisol levels at night or overnight can make it harder to fall asleep or stay asleep. A lot of patients will self-medicate with melatonin and think, well, this doesn't work. Why isn't it working? It's usually because their cortisol levels are too high at night. And
that's a big one. I see that and I hear that a lot. I'm trying melatonin at night and I'm like, and how's your energy then the next morning? Oh, it's really down. It's like, well, melatonin's actually a depressant. That's its goal in the body, is to bring the system down and to bring you into sleep. Taking it in the middle of the night or randomly not beneficial. Maybe for the jet lag, you fly to London or you come back, or, those trips just to get you back on schedule. Okay, great. But otherwise, probably something else that could help with the elevated cortisol levels that people are experiencing. That's a big, big deal.
Yeah. And I see this a lot in endurance athletes where, particularly the marathoners or the people who are training for marathons or half marathons, that type of intense physical activity for prolonged periods of time means that cortisol levels will be a little higher for longer. And that can lead to blood sugar issues because cortisol is basically a hormone that will ultimately result in increasing your blood sugar. And that's its intended effect. That's a good effect to have, but it's not meant for it to be the norm. As you know, when people have high cortisol levels for prolonged periods of time, they can often develop blood sugar issues. Marathoners often have higher hemoglobin A1Cs because of that, because they've got this elevated cortisol for a longer period of time and their diet is great. Their training is intense. You'd look at them and you'd say, this person doesn't look like they have a high blood sugar, but they do. And most of the time that's due to chronically elevated cortisol levels.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. In our day and age, everyone is go, go, go. I don't know too many people that are getting the amount of rejuvenation, the amount of sleep. Sleep is suffering a lot. I mean, with the amount of devices that we have, the amount of screen time, the evening time. When I talk to people about sleep, I mean, even in my own practice, sleep is, people are like, well, the old, I'll sleep when I'm dead kind of a thing. It's sad, but it's pretty prevalent. And people don't really even sometimes think about it. But I hear a lot, just not being able to unplug and just to go to sleep, get that adequate amount of sleep. And then like you talked about, that waking in the middle of the night piece, when it's regular, that can be a problem, especially if, so think about cortisol levels.
Yeah, absolutely.
So cell signaling was our third. I love this framework that you have because this is really nice for people to see that there is a structure to be followed in investigating what's going on. I think that the snippets that you have for everybody, even on your website, it's great. I'll have the links in the show notes for everybody, but ca4sport.com. You guys can get on there and look at what's the framework that Dr. Brown's talking about here with everything. So let's move on to the next one.
Yeah, structural integrity. And this is kind of what we were talking about earlier, how I'm really kind of focused on, not necessarily on the macro structures like the muscles and joints and things like that, which are important. They definitely have a place in sports med and are definitely important. I know a number of good surgeons and physical therapists and chiropractors that are awesome, important part of the care team. Also, I'm looking at this structural integrity from more of a genetic standpoint. Are they set up genetically to where their body is producing enzymes that work as well as they should, or maybe a little slower, or maybe a little faster in some cases? Looking at their genetics helps me get some sense of that. There are genetic Snips that are pretty common. Snips are basically single nucleotide polymorphisms, and these are things that basically are pretty common genetic mutations that might result in us making an enzyme that's supposed to function in a pathway one way, but might be a little less functional, or it might be a little too functional in some cases. But I look at Snips, single nucleotide polymorphisms, as part of my workup, so to speak. There are some common ones like COMT, catechol-O-methyltransferase, which dictates how well we can metabolize our estrogens, environmental toxins, and catecholamines.
What are catecholamines?
Catecholamines are stress hormones that are produced by the adrenal medulla. They're the fight or flight hormones. If people have COMT SNPs, their enzyme that metabolizes those stress hormones doesn't quite work as well. It's functioning slower. So if that patient is also B vitamin deficient, then it really sets them up for failure in terms of being able to metabolize those stress hormones, environmental toxins, and things like estrogens. So if they have that SNP, it can be really important to make sure that they have enough B vitamins to get as much functionality out of that enzyme as possible, because it can lead to problems with those things building up in the body, which can be a bad thing.
When I think about this, I'm like, this is cutting edge. I mean, really, you'd think that this would be a part of someday this will be a standard part of a workup for patients, right? I mean, I feel like, and I hope that this is the way it is, but I mean, how do you know what you need and how do you know what your individual needs are? I mean, again, going back to that over and over again, is that we are all very unique individuals, and structural at the micro level, being DNA, how are you set up to function? How can we modify the things that aren't set up to function optimally? That's critical. And I know that, I mean, I've dealt with some of that as well. I mean, I've gone in and gotten some genetic testing done. I did my, what was it called? 23andMe. And I got the raw data from 23andMe. And then I uploaded it to like MTHFR support, which was really neat. I mean, which is kind of like, this is stuff you work with too. You can use this data to figure out, well, how are they detoxifying? You know, what are the detox SNPs there? I mean, what are the, energy production? How's your methylation? Methylation's a common thing people are hearing about now. This is your blueprint. You were given a copy from, mom and dad, and you have a unique copy combined from both of them. How do you interface with the environment? So,
yeah. And I picked up an analogy recently. I can't remember who this was from. I wish I could credit them. But they mentioned that when looking at genetics from this type of perspective, that it's maybe a little more like a recipe than a blueprint. And the reason why is because when, let's say we're baking cookies and we're following that recipe exactly, the exact amount of flour, the exact amount of sugar, the exact amount of ingredients, everything is the same. And we're baking 2 sets of cookies back to back. And we follow that recipe exactly to the milligram. Well, when you pull those cookies out of the oven, they're not going to look the same. There's some variability in terms of humidity. There's some variability in terms of, does the air hit the ingredients in exactly the same way in the oven? There's X factors, in other words, that can create some variation. Those chocolate chips are not going to show up in exactly the same pattern. So it is really complex. But I like that analogy because it does leave a little more room for X factors. Just seems a good way to think about it, because genes aren't always our destiny.
That's a critical phrase that you used right there. I mean, I think people, when they think about, genetics, it's not the ultimate. It's not the end product. Mm-hmm. It's now, what are we going to do with those genetics, right? And this is kind of I think where you're maybe even going with it. So take it away, because this is really good. Wow, I'm loving this.
Genes aren't our destiny. That gets said a lot in the functional medicine community. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Just because we have an ApoE SNP or something like that, it doesn't mean that we're going to get a particular disease outcome. Or just because we have a COMT SNP or an MTHFR SNP, you name it, doesn't guarantee that we'll see that. And one of the probably, I would say maybe the most innovative thing I've seen in testing, and I'm a little bit biased towards Genova, but I would have told you this even if I hadn't been working there, was they have combined some profiles with genetics and the genotypic information, the genetics, and the phenotypic information, the metabolites. And that combination of genetics and metabolites gives a really complete picture as far as what's going on. And it allows you to see sometimes the patient does not need the particular support for that enzyme because their diet is great, their stress management is good, they're taking care of these other things in their diet and lifestyle that are helping those genes, and they're helping them to be expressed in the right way. That's a really innovative way to look at things, and it's really illuminating.
I love the saying, if tell me if I'm remembering this right, at IFM, they say genetics loads the gun and environment pulls the trigger.
Exactly.
And I really appreciate that. I mean, that's really simple way for people to understand what's going on. I mean, if it's just priming the situation, but it's not pulling the trigger, well, what is pulling the trigger? That's what you have control over.
Yes.
And
yes.
so
we all have control over that.
That's right. This is what you're talking about, whether it's hormones, your cortisol levels are really high. Remember, we just talked about that. I mean, that can predispose you to cancers and dementia and all kinds of other things if you're living in a chronically stressed state for a lot of your life. So it's really important to be able to look at what are you doing that might be pulling the trigger. And people don't know unless they get the assessment, right? Or get checked out and kind of look at some of this stuff and get some innovative testing done.
Right.
That's great.
Earlier on in my career, patients would come to see me and based on their clinical history and physical exam and working them up, I could think of 50, 60 supplements to put them on and 20 different things to recommend about their lifestyle or their diet. But I really felt like I needed some sort of direction and some way I could sort of break this down and get more data and make better quality decisions about the patient's care. And that's where testing is become really valuable to me.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty common theme. If I have just some blood tests sometimes, I mean, it doesn't give me enough information. And I feel sometimes like based on the symptoms and some simple blood work, I don't have enough information. I might be trying multiple things to even have one effect. I might try a couple things that are ineffective to be able to get to the thing that's effective for them. So what you're doing with that specific testing, it allows you to get right to what's going to be the efficient pathway to be able to help and have the intended effect.
Yeah. The highest quality intervention I can come up with is without testing. It'd be hard for me to do that. I think we can certainly try a bunch of different things, but often it costs more to do that, to experiment and do therapeutic trials of different things. It can take more time and it can sometimes just be kind of frustrating. So I feel like I'm able to add a degree of precision with incorporating specialty testing into my practice that I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise.
Yes. It's kind of fun. I was just thinking about it. I diagnose Instagramosis a lot with my patients,
Yeah.
whether they're on like a different diet or a different supplement that they've ordered off of Instagram. And I'm like, So anyways, I have some specific clients in mind that I could send your way for something a little bit more precise.
That is funny. Yes. I'm seeing that a lot too. Yes. Should I take this?
Nothing wrong with those mediums. It's a shot in the dark, right? So the next part of your framework.
Detoxification. This can mean in the sports medicine realm, athletic patients, people who are professional athletes. This is a tricky one because I think of detoxification mostly around dealing with too much oxidative stress. And oxidative stress is basically oxidation that happens to your cells. It's kind of like your cells rusting, so to speak. That rust is oxidation on metal. The same thing can happen to your cells, although it doesn't show up as rust. It shows up as cell damage.
Which damages your genetics inside the cells even too, right?
Yes, could damage any part of the cell. The membrane, the DNA, oxidative damage is an underlying factor, is one of the underlying factors for many disease processes. It's a shocking number of disease processes. And people who are athletically minded they tend to have more oxidative stress because they're burning through their antioxidants more quickly. They're burning through other nutrients more quickly because they're pushing their bodies harder than the average person. And particularly if they're doing endurance exercise, that involves taking in a lot of oxygen, aerobic exercise, and burning, having that mitochondria fire on all cylinders for long periods of time. There's potential to generate a lot of oxidative stress. The reason why this can be tricky, though, is because oxidative stress is also kind of part of the adaptation process for athletes. So we don't want way too much and we don't want none. We don't want to suppress it completely with antioxidants. We want to find that happy medium. This requires a lot of experience in this because there are some levels of oxidative stress that I think are okay given a given training regimen, and some levels that might be a little too high and might be a little dangerous. And the only way you could be able to tell if you have oxidative stress is through testing, because it's not really a symptom associated with it. It's nothing.
What are some of the labs that you're looking at to check for oxidative stress?
There's 4 markers that I think are really helpful for this. One of them is CoQ10, pretty easy to measure. Glutathione, pretty easy to measure as well.
Master antioxidant in the body, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. The other two are less common, but they are part of specialty diagnostics. And they're things like 8-OHDG, which is oxidative damage to DNA. It's evidence of that. That can be measured in the urine. And then there's lipid peroxides, which can also be measured in the urine. That's damage to cell membranes. So those are pretty easy tests to do. They're urine tests just based off of a first morning urine. It's evidence of oxidative damage. So it's really kind of one of the biggest problems for athletes as I see it. But of course, in the broader sense of detoxification, certainly we could be exposed to heavy metals through seafood or water or occupational exposures. And that also can be important.
This reminds me, before I leave, I need to get on the phone with Chris Weekly and get a big panel ordered of all my stuff because started doing CrossFit. I'm obviously way more sore. There's a whole different, I've changed nutritional stuff since we visited last. There was some changes that I've made, and it's coming to me now that yes, I would like to make sure that I'm doing the right thing with what I've got going on and that I don't need any dialing in. And I'm glad I've got my clinical interpreter on the other end.
Yeah, shout out to Chris Weekly.
Yeah, right.
From Genova.
Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, great guy.
And so after detoxification, let's talk about the immune response.
Yes, this is the last area of my framework here. And the immune system is extremely complex. I always tell all of my patients that. As you know, studying immunology, the more you study it, the more complex it gets. I don't think anything in the immune system is easy because it's always defending us against inflammation, against infections. It's constantly trying to figure out, is this something I need to kill in the body or is this something I need to let go? And so it's making those decisions all the time.
I always say invaders, foreign and domestic.
Yes, yes.
Right.
And if it becomes overactive, then it can start attacking us. And that's what autoimmunity is. It's extremely complex, but there are some common parts of the immune system that we can assess for and some interventions that we can take to help balance immune function. For athletes, my focus here has been on looking at immune responses in the gut. And part of the reason is because intense bouts of physical activity, of course, they can raise cortisol levels, as we talked about earlier, but that effect can be suppressive to some parts of the immune system. So there's some immune imbalance that sometimes needs to be addressed. And a lot of that happens in the gut. So if we're seeing elevated levels of secretory IgA in stool, things like that, then we'll take measures to address that so that we don't have too much or too little immune response. And then, of course, you add on to that the fact that some types of physical activity, patients or clients are involved in person-to-person contact, depending on the sport. So there's plenty of reasons for the immune system to get out of balance, whether it's reacting to something they've been exposed to or suppressing their own immune system or gut imbalances leading to immune dysregulation. So there's a lot that goes into it. But I try to address some degree of immune balance with my patients.
Why don't you speak to autoimmune disease? Because I feel like this is something that is becoming more and more prevalent, us finding out that our patients either have, whether it's thyroid, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, whether it's lupus, these different conditions that people do have. Speak about autoimmune disease and where do you believe a lot of this stuff starts?
Yeah, I think a lot of it starts in the gut. Maybe not every case of autoimmunity because the immune system's so complex. But I think a lot of the times when there's altered intestinal permeability, meaning leakiness to the intestinal lining, in some parts of the small intestine, there's only one cell separating us from the stuff in our gut to the stuff in our bodies. And if those cells that are in some cases one cell thick, which is extremely small, if there's damage to that lining, then we could have too many things from the outside world in our intestinal tract coming into our bloodstream. If we're being attacked, if we're not supposed to have a lot of antigens in our bloodstream, or we're not supposed to have pathogens coming across the gut barrier, that kind of thing upregulates our immune system. We have this upregulation of the immune system, partly in many cases due to intestinal permeability. Our immune system starts to attack everything, including ourselves. So I think altered mucosal integrity in the small intestine in particular is one of the reasons for autoimmunity.
So if I think about it like almost like a brick wall, but all of a sudden you're missing all the mortar that holds all the bricks together. Rainwater, all the outside forces of nature are going to be getting through. All the bugs, all the scorpions here in the desert, everything's going to come into the house, right?
Yeah.
Of course, your defenses are going to have to be on high alert inside the house to be able to defend yourself from all these invaders. When you're in a space like that, I mean, what are some of the things that would maybe even cause some of that altered permeability or that intestinal permeability / leaky gut that you're talking about? What are some of the common things that you see?
It's a whole list of reasons, unfortunately. It's things like bacterial imbalance in the gut that can lead to intestinal permeability issues, infections like pathogens that get into the gut. Stress can do it. Prolonged physical activity can do it. Partly because there's a shunting of blood flow away from the GI tract. When we're pushing our muscles for a long period of time, we get less blood flow to the gut. Food allergies and sensitivities, probably one of the biggest reasons. Medications, some medications like NSAIDs. I see that a lot with athletes who are using NSAIDs every day, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories.
Yes. You give some common ones. What are some of the common ones?
Ibuprofen.
There you go.
So, so that can lead to permeability.
If they're sore, it's a vitamin I deficiency. So then they go for the ibuprofen
right.
to just knock it down. And well, that's not optimal, right? We don't want to have no inflammation.
Exactly.
And, look at what else can happen.
Mm-hmm.
Leaky gut.
Alcohol. There's a lot of different reasons why we can develop permeability.
Some of the common ones I feel like I see are like toxins that people are taking in, medications. And then the joke with some of my teachers at school was gluten is the new Al-Qaeda, so it's making its way in, destroying a lot of things and creating some of these problems, but it's not everything for everybody. Certainly not. But anyways, if you're predisposed and you've got the potential to being gluten intolerant, for example, that's just one of the many, it's a heavy hitter. People talk about gluten quite a bit. But this is neat. You gave us a good breakdown of all of that. This is great. I mean, what would be the best way for people to reach out to you with questions? Because I know that there's going to be questions from this. Is it through your website, Instagram, Facebook? I mean, which ways do people interface with you?
They can email me directly if they like, drbrown@ca4sport.com. And that's the number 4. Or they can go to my website, ca4sport.com. I'm on Facebook. I'm not on there very much, but I have a Facebook page, Clinical Advances for Sport. I'm on Twitter, not very much, but you'll find me there at DocWB, DOCWB. I'd say email is probably the best way.
Great. Yeah. If you want to reach out to me and see it, I'm happy to connect you guys directly with him as well. So he's definitely someone who's, on the forefront of all of the positive changes, positive testing and just very, very dynamic abilities to be able to dial in who you can become and all the potential that you have if you are trying to be your best. I mean, you got to know what that takes. So even like myself, like I said, I need to get my stuff dialed in with you. So we're going to get some stuff ordered up here. This is good.
It's fun.
It is fun. Yeah. And it's like, you want to believe you're doing the right thing for yourself, right? And some of us just get so entrenched in the ways that we're doing things. And we're like, no, this has got to be the best. And then we've got confirmation bias and we find things where it's like, oh, this says that I'm doing it the best way this way and whatever. And so you end up feeling like I don't even want to find out that maybe I'm doing something wrong to myself. This is the far end of, I got some things going wrong, but you know what? I probably am doing everything just right. Well, there's nothing wrong with taking a bite of humble pie, getting some testing done and just looking at it and being like, okay, because in the end, look at how many years of life people have left to live in a better space.
All about improving the health span and trying to get people to be as healthy as possible for as long as possible. That's my goal for every patient, is to help them perform their best, feel their best, and to be as healthy as possible for as long as possible.
Beautiful. I love it. So great having you on the podcast.
Awesome, Warren, to be
on
the podcast. I'm so excited. I'm such a big fan of the podcast. So I'm just thrilled to be on it.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm excited for your move back to Georgia and back to being close to the family and everything like that too. And I'm just so excited that we've gotten to spend some time here together. So when you've been here in Arizona
it's been awesome.
too. Yeah. So thanks a ton. We'll have you on again soon.
My pleasure. I'd love to.
Hey, thanks for listening to the Rise Again podcast. Great episode, hey? You know what? I really love interviewing people, and I love getting people on who have things to share with the world. So if you have a really cool guest that you'd like to get on the podcast, email me and I will do my best to get them on the show. I hope you guys have a phenomenal week and stay tuned for the next episode of the Rise Again podcast.